Daenerys Targaryen learned everything she knew about power from the men who loved her. Not from books, not from councils, not from anyone who sat her down and explained how the world actually worked. She learned it the hard way, one relationship at a time, and by the end, the lessons had added up to something almost nobody around her fully understood until it was too late. Here's the claim, stated plainly. You cannot understand Daenerys' ending without understanding these four men, because each one taught her a different, incomplete truth about power, and she spent her entire life assembling those fragments into a philosophy that eventually consumed her. If you're new here, this is Mereth Tales. We go beyond what happened and into why it worked. Subscribe now, because by the end of this video you'll see her entire arc completely differently. Let's start with the man who taught her the first, most brutal lesson. Khal Drogo enters her life as a transaction. Her own brother sells her to a warlord for an army that never comes, and the marriage begins as exactly what it looks like. A girl handed over to a stranger she has no power to refuse. Watch what the show does carefully here, because it matters for everything that follows. It doesn't romanticize the beginning. It shows you powerlessness first, honestly, before it shows you anything else. What Drogo actually teaches her isn't romance. It's the discovery that fear can transform into something else entirely once you find a way to stop being afraid. She learns his language, not because anyone asks her to, but because understanding is the first form of control available to someone with no other kind. And somewhere in that process, genuine connection grows between them, not because the circumstances were ever acceptable, but because Daenerys, even at her most powerless, was already looking for the exit from powerlessness itself. Here's the lesson she takes from him, whether she articulates it this way or not. Power can be earned through respect, even inside circumstances you never chose. When Drogo dies, and she walks into his funeral pyre and emerges with 3 living dragons, she isn't just grieving him. She's proving, to herself more than anyone, that the lesson held, that she could turn the worst possible beginning into the foundation of something entirely her own. That's the first fragment. Power grows from turning what was done to you into what you can do to the world instead. Now, Daario Naharis, and this relationship teaches her something almost nobody talks about honestly. By the time Daario enters her life, Daenerys is no longer the powerless girl from the Dothraki Sea. She's a queen, a conqueror, someone with armies and dragons and real command over her own fate. And her relationship with Daario is, for the first time in her adult life, something chosen freely, for pleasure and companionship rather than survival or strategy. Watch what that actually represents. Daario is skilled, useful to her cause, genuinely devoted, and also, crucially, replaceable in a way none of her other relationships ever are. He never challenges her authority. He never complicates her decisions with competing claims or inconvenient loyalties. He is, in the clearest possible sense, safe. Here's the lesson that relationship quietly teaches her, one she may never fully recognize in herself. Power, once you have enough of it, can insulate you from the kind of vulnerability real intimacy requires. Daario lets her experience closeness without risk, because nothing about their relationship ever threatens the throne she's building toward. That's not love diminished. It's love adapted to fit inside a life that has stopped being able to afford real vulnerability anywhere else. When she eventually leaves him behind in Meereen, choosing her war over her relationship without much visible hesitation, that's not coldness for its own sake. It's the second fragment of her philosophy fully formed. Power requires the ability to set aside whatever doesn't serve the larger goal, even people who love you honestly. Now Jorah Mormont, because his devotion teaches her the most complicated lesson of all, precisely because he never asks for anything in return. Jorah loves her almost from the beginning, and almost never says so directly, and that unspoken devotion becomes one of the steadiest, most consistent forces in her entire life. He advises her honestly, even when honesty risks her anger. He protects her at real cost to himself. Exiled, diseased, aging alone in her service, returning again and again despite every reason to simply stop. Watch what Jorah actually represents in her education about power. He's proof that loyalty can exist without romantic reciprocation, that some of the most valuable devotion in her life will never ask to be repaid in kind. And here's the uncomfortable part worth sitting with. Daenerys, across years of his devotion, largely takes that loyalty for granted. She values him, genuinely, but rarely interrogates what it costs him to keep giving her everything and receiving so little of the specific thing he actually wants back. That's the third fragment, and it's the darkest one. Power attracts people willing to love you unconditionally, and it becomes dangerously easy to mistake that unconditional loyalty for something owed to you rather than something freely given. When Jorah dies protecting her at Winterfell, throwing himself between her and the army of the dead, it's the purest expression of everything he'd been teaching her for years, and by then, it's worth asking honestly whether she'd ever fully learned the lesson he'd been offering the whole time. Now, finally, Jon Snow, because his relationship with her breaks every rule the previous three had quietly taught her, and that's exactly why it destroys her. Jon doesn't need her the way Drogo's Khalasar needed a leader. He doesn't orbit her the way Daario does, uncomplicated and replaceable. And unlike Jorah, he doesn't simply give devotion without asking anything back. Jon Snow is the first person in Daenerys' adult life who has a claim that could actually rival her own, a moral compass that doesn't automatically defer to her judgment, and a form of love that comes with real, structural complications attached. That's precisely why it's so devastating when the truth about his identity comes out. Every previous relationship had taught her, in its own way, that love could be organized around her power, made safe, made subordinate to what she was building. Jon is the first relationship that refuses to be organized that way. His claim to the throne is stronger than hers by every law Westeros recognizes. His love for her doesn't erase that fact, and it doesn't make him willing to simply set it aside for her comfort. Here's the lesson this relationship forces on her, too late and too fast to properly absorb. Real power, the kind that exists outside your own control entirely, cannot be managed the way she'd learned to manage everything else. She can't earn Jon's claim away from him through respect, the way she'd earned Drogo's Khalasar. She can't set him aside for the larger goal, the way she'd set Daario aside. And unlike Jorah, his loyalty was never going to be unconditional if it meant abandoning what he believed was right. Watch how she responds to that impossible position. Every fragment of power she'd assembled from 3 previous relationships suddenly fails to apply. And faced with a kind of powerlessness she hadn't felt since Drogo first took her hand, she reaches for the only tool that had ever reliably worked before: force, fire. The thing that had turned her from a powerless girl into an unstoppable queen in the first place. That's the tragedy hiding inside this final relationship, and it's worth naming clearly. Jon doesn't cause her fall by loving her. He causes it by being the first person whose love couldn't be absorbed into the philosophy of power she'd spent her entire adult life constructing, one relationship at a time. Drogo taught her that power grows from turning powerlessness into strength. Daario taught her that power means setting aside whatever doesn't serve the larger goal. Jorah taught her, without meaning to, that unconditional loyalty could be taken for granted. And Jon, finally, showed her the one thing none of the others ever could: that some things in this world genuinely cannot be conquered, controlled, or absorbed into a throne. no matter how completely you've learned to burn away everything else that once stood in your path. She never got the chance to learn that lesson slowly, the way she'd learned all the others. Jon killed her before she could. Maybe that's the real story hiding underneath 4 relationships that fans usually discuss separately, disconnected from each other. Daenerys Targaryen wasn't simply a woman who fell in love 4 times. She was a queen who kept assembling an entire philosophy of power out of the people who loved her, and never noticed, until it was far too late, that the philosophy itself was the thing that was always going to destroy her. If this changed how you see her story, subscribe now, because we're not done unpacking the relationships that actually explain this show.